5 years before police found 16 children inside a small Ohio home, 6 children from the same family had already disappeared from another place, their elementary school. And unlike what many people first assumed after the case exploded in June 2026, there had been a warning. School officials noticed. An attendance officer went to court. A judge issued paperwork. A deputy was sent to the family's home. But when he arrived, there was nobody there. The house was listed as vacant. The family had moved. And according to records later obtained by ABC6 Investigates, the sheriff's office records produced to the station showed only that one documented attempt to serve the family. Months later, the truancy cases were terminated because the parents and children could not be located. Then the trail went cold. More than 4 years passed, until June 30, 2026. Police entered another house, this time in the tiny village of Hamden. Inside were 16 children. Some had to be hospitalized. Authorities alleged that many of them had spent much of their lives isolated inside a roughly 12 by 12-foot area contaminated with human waste. 4 adults were arrested, and suddenly, an old set of school records from another Ohio county took on a completely different meaning, because the question was no longer simply, how could 16 children remain hidden for years? There was now another question, a far more uncomfortable one. If authorities knew years earlier that 6 children from this family had stopped attending school, what happened after they disappeared? And could there have been an opportunity to find them much sooner? The story begins in Gallia County, Ohio. The year is 2021. At the time, members of the Siders family were living in southeastern Ohio. 6 children associated with Elizabeth Siders and Gary Siders Jr. were enrolled at Adaville Elementary School. But during the 2021-2022 school year, something changed. The children stopped regularly attending. This was not simply a few missed mornings. According to complaints later obtained by ABC6, each of the 6 children accumulated more than 72 hours of unexcused absences. That threshold triggered formal action. The parents were warned. An attendance intervention process was attempted. But according to the complaints, the attendance problem continued. So on October 19, 2021, Gallia County Local Schools Attendance Officer Ronald Hammond took the next step. He filed cases in juvenile court. 6 children, 6 truancy complaints. And now, for the first time, the family's disappearance from school was no longer just an educational problem. It had become part of the court record. 3 days later, the juvenile court issued paperwork to bring the parents into court. Elizabeth Siders and Gary Siders Jr. were expected to appear the following month. The documents had to be served, so on October 25th, a Gallia County deputy went to the address authorities had for the family. What he found would later become one of the most important details in the entire story. The return of service contained a simple notation: moved, vacant. The family was gone, and 6 children who had already disappeared from school had now disappeared from the address known to the court. This was the moment when the story could have gone in several different directions. Perhaps another address would be found. Perhaps another school district would enroll the children. Perhaps the family would contact the court. Perhaps another government record would reveal where they had gone. But based on the sheriff's records subsequently provided to ABC6 Investigates, there was no documented second attempt by that office to serve the family. That does not prove nobody else searched. It does not prove the school district stopped trying. And it does not establish misconduct by any individual agency. ABC6 reported that the school district said some attendance-related information was protected by education privacy laws, meaning the public record does not reveal every action that may have occurred. That distinction matters, because this case is disturbing enough without adding things the evidence cannot prove. What the available records do show is this: 6 children were missing large amounts of school. Formal complaints were filed. Court proceedings began. A deputy went to the family's listed home. The property was vacant. The parents and children could not be served. And then, in January 2022, the juvenile cases were terminated because their whereabouts were unknown, not resolved. Not because the attendance problem had been corrected, not because records showed the children had returned to class. Well, the court documents cited the inability to locate and serve the family. The cases could potentially be revisited if the parties became available. But the records reviewed by reporters did not show that happening. And after that, the visible paper trail becomes remarkably thin. Think about what that means. 6 elementary school-aged children had been part of a system in which adults outside their family saw them. Teachers could notice whether they arrived. Attendance staff could notice when they disappeared. Records could show whether they were present. And then that connection stopped. The children were no longer sitting in those classrooms. And years later, when investigators found the family in Vinton County, officials said the school district there had no record of the children attending its schools. That is the gap at the center of this story. Not one day, not 1 month, years. But there is another reason the Gallia County chapter matters. The Hamden house may not have been the family's only home associated with troubling questions. ABC6 later traced the family to another property near Cheshire in Gallia County. A neighbor told reporters that the family largely kept to themselves. She rarely saw the children. Her relatives had apparently interacted with some of them around 2001 or 2022, but even people living nearby seemed to have only limited contact with the family. Eventually, the Siders family left that property too. Then, in May 2026, just weeks before the Hamden arrests, a new owner acquired the old Gallia County house. His name was Bruce Gullick. He began renovating, and what he told ABC6 he found inside was disturbing. Children's clothing stuffed into the attic, and what he described as urine, human feces, and animal feces inside the property. That account requires caution. Gullick purchased the home after the family was gone. His observations do not establish exactly when every condition developed. They do not prove who is responsible for each thing he found, and they cannot tell us precisely what the house looked like while the children lived there. But they raise a critical question. Were the alleged conditions eventually discovered in Hamden part of something that had begun much earlier? Because now 2 timelines begin to overlap. In 2008, 6 children stop attending school in Gallia County. Court complaints follow. Authorities go to the listed address. The family is gone. Years later, the family's former Gallia County property is described by its new owner as badly contaminated. And then, on June 30th, 2026, investigators enter another family residence in neighboring Vinton County. What they discover there shocks even experienced law enforcement officers. 16 children are inside. Authorities say most had been confined to an approximately 12 by 12-foot area. The room contained human feces. Investigators said the living conditions were deplorable. 7 children required hospital treatment. 2 were flown to a higher-level trauma facility. Officials also described severe developmental concerns involving some of the children. One 18-year-old, whom authorities said may have developmental disabilities, reportedly could not spell her own name. The 4 adults living in connection with the home, Gary Siders Jr., Elizabeth Siders, Gary Siders Sr., and Christina Siders, were each charged with 16 counts of child endangering. Those are allegations. All 4 defendants are entitled to the presumption of innocence unless and until the state proves the charges in court. But the discovery created an immediate mystery. How did 16 children remain almost invisible? Neighbors said they did not know so many children were living there. Investigators themselves had not gone to the residence because they knew children were inside. According to officials, the children were discovered while law enforcement was executing a search warrant connected to another investigation. That fact is crucial. Police did not arrive at the Hamden home because the 2021 truancy cases had finally led them there. As far as the public record currently shows, those old school cases were not the trail that ultimately produced the rescue. The children were found during something else, and that creates one of the hardest questions in the entire case. If that unrelated investigation had never happened, when would someone have found them? Authorities have said the family appeared to have become very effective at staying outside the normal systems that often bring children into contact with other adults. School, medical care, government agencies, neighbors, community activities. Every one of those contacts can create another pair of eyes. And for vulnerable children, sometimes that matters enormously. A teacher may notice a child suddenly losing weight. A school nurse may see untreated injuries. A counselor may notice fear. An attendance officer may recognize when a child simply stops showing up. In this case, that last safeguard did activate. The children disappeared. The school noticed. The attendance officer acted. The court became involved. But after the address turned out to be vacant, the trail appears to have fractured. Different pieces of information sat in different places. School records, juvenile court files, sheriff's service documents, property records, records in different counties, and perhaps other information the public still has not seen. No single record told the whole story. That fragmentation has now attracted attention at the Ohio State House. State Senator Bill Blessing said after the Hamden discovery that Ohio may need to examine whether stronger safeguards are necessary for children who are not attending traditional schools. One idea he raised was whether government information could be periodically cross-checked to identify situations in which children appear to vanish from normal oversight. The issue is politically sensitive. Millions of American parents educate their children at home legally and responsibly. Homeschooling itself is not evidence of neglect. Moving is not evidence of abuse. Missing school does not automatically mean a child is in danger, and none of those things, by themselves, prove what was happening inside the Siders family's homes. But that is not really the central question. The question raised by this case is narrower. What should happen when children disappear from school, and nobody can establish where they went? Because there is an important difference between knowing that a child is homeschooled and simply not knowing where that child is. And according to the 2021 court records, the parents and 6 children could not be located for service. Their whereabouts were unknown. That is what makes the old truancy files so significant now. At the time, they may have looked like ordinary attendance cases. Years later, they look like something else. A warning. Not necessarily a warning that proved abuse was occurring, but a warning that 6 children had disappeared from view. There is another detail buried in those old records that feels different when read today. Some juvenile paperwork reportedly categorized the children themselves as unruly because of habitual truancy. That was a legal classification connected to their school attendance. But consider their ages. Elementary school children do not control where the family lives. They do not control whether a parent takes them to school. They do not decide whether court papers reach the adults in their home. Years later, those same children would become part of a case in which prosecutors describe them not as children refusing to attend school, but as alleged victims of adults responsible for their care. That contrast is difficult to ignore. In 2021, the visible problem was attendance. In 2026, the alleged problem was something far more serious. What happened between those years remains one of the largest unanswered parts of this case, and journalists trying to reconstruct that period encountered another revealing problem. ABC6 initially asked the Gallia County Sheriff's Office for incident reports involving Elizabeth Siders and Gary Siders Jr. The office reportedly said there were none. But after journalists found the juvenile court files and made another records request focused on service, the sheriff's office produced the October 25, 2021 document showing the deputy had gone to the residence and found it vacant. The sheriff's explanation was that a service record is different from an incident report. Technically, those are different categories of records. But the episode shows exactly why reconstructing this family's history is so complicated. The information existed. It simply was not all sitting in one obvious file, and government boundaries added another complication. Gallia County and Vinton County are neighbors. A family can cross a county line quickly, but school districts, juvenile courts, sheriff's offices, and children's services operate through separate administrative systems. If a child leaves one district and never arrives in another, the question becomes, who owns the problem? The old district? The new district? The court? Law enforcement? Children's services? And what if nobody knows what the new district even is? Those questions matter far beyond this one Ohio family, because children who are truly being hidden are, by definition, difficult to protect. They do not call reporters. They may not know how to contact police. Some may be too young. Some may have disabilities. Some may not understand that the conditions they are living in are abnormal. Their protection often depends on adults outside the home noticing something, and sometimes the only clue is an empty chair at school. That is why the 6 truancy cases from 2021 deserve attention now, not because they prove that authorities could have prevented everything that followed. We cannot know that, not because an attendance officer should somehow have predicted what police would allegedly discover 5 years later. That would be hindsight. The real significance is simpler. There was a moment when 6 children stopped appearing. Adults noticed. Formal action began. And then the children became unreachable. After that, the public record does not yet provide a clear account of who, if anyone, successfully determined where they were living and whether they were safe. The criminal investigation may eventually answer some of those questions. The ongoing court cases may reveal more. Additional agency records may surface, and because judges have issued restrictions on public comments in parts of the criminal proceedings, some information may not become available until much later. But we already know enough to see the shape of the mystery. October 2021. 6 children are missing too much school. Complaints are filed. October 25th. A deputy goes to their house. Moved. Vacant. January 2022. The court cases are terminated because the family cannot be located. Then the years pass. 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, and into 2026. No ordinary school record in Vinton County brings these children back into public view. Neighbors reportedly see almost nothing. Then on June 30th, investigators arrive at the Hamden house for another reason. They open the door, and suddenly there are 16 children. That sequence is what makes this story so haunting, because the discovery in 2026 did not begin in 2026. There had been another moment, years earlier. 6 empty school seats, 6 attendance cases, 1 empty house, and then silence. And today, 4 adults face serious felony charges. The children are in protective custody, and Ohio officials are debating whether changes are necessary to prevent children from disappearing between the cracks of separate systems. The courts will decide whether the defendants are criminally responsible for the allegations against them. But there is another question no verdict can answer by itself. What should a system do when a child disappears? Not when abuse has already been proven. Not when police already know where the child is. But at the earlier moment, when a school says, the child is no longer here. A court says, we cannot serve the family. And the address says, vacant. How many attempts are enough? How many databases should be checked? How many agencies should be told? And at what point does truancy stop being only an attendance problem and become a question of whether a child is safe? Because 5 years before Ohio investigators found 16 children inside that Hamden home, 6 children connected to the same family had already vanished from school. The warning was not hidden. It was written into court records. The family was gone. And the question that remains today is devastatingly simple. Where did everyone think those children had gone?